Thanks, Stephanie. It's a pleasure to introduce Sarah Rothman to give her entrance seminar today, or I guess poster seminar presentation. So Sarah came to us from Pennsylvania State University, where she did her master's on restoration ecology of surface mine sites focused on grassland communities. Before that, Sarah did her bachelor's degree at Franklin Marshall College in Lancaster. And over the course of her bachelor's and master's degrees, she's also been involved in various other research projects, including deer management in Valley Forge, National Historical Park, and so forth. Sarah was fortunate to come to us and secure a flagship fellowship, which was a great achievement. And since she's been here, she's also secured a Washington Biologist Field Club research grant, which was fantastic, and just published a small communication as well related to her work that she's going to present today. So with that, it's my pleasure to hand over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Paul. Yes, I'm excited to tell everyone today about my proposed dissertation on mosquitoes and urban green space across socioeconomic gradients. Briefly acknowledging Washington Biologist Field Club as well as the NSF for supporting the work I've been able to do so far. So in this brief presentation, I'll attempt to give a quick background on mosquitoes and the importance of their plant resources, and then review some of the research that Dr. Leesnum and his previous students and collaborators have done on the relationship between mosquitoes and socioeconomics in two watersheds, watershed 263 in Baltimore, and the Watts Branch watershed, which straddles Capitol Heights, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. Across the US, urban plants have also been shown to vary along the socioeconomic gradient, including a study in Baltimore County. But little has been done on the intersection of these three in Baltimore City and Watts Branch, and that's the gap that my dissertation aims to fill. Mosquitoes are the deadliest animals on Earth. They vector a plethora of diseases, and while many are more common in the tropical regions like malaria, we do have ongoing and escalating transmission of arboviruses here in the contiguous US, including Eastern equine encephalitis, Zika, chikungunya, and West Nile viruses. And mosquitoes also pose a public health threat as a nuisance. They discourage outdoor activities and have been linked to rising childhood obesity rates. So the two mosquitoes that I'm going to focus on in my dissertation are Culex pipiens and Aedes albopictus. Culex pipiens is also known as the northern house mosquito. It's non-native, but it's been here for several hundred years, so it's a resident species. Adult females will take a blood meal in order to acquire enough protein to lay eggs, which they do on the surface of water. And in urban areas, that's often in artificial container habitats, like this cooler. When the eggs hatch, they feed on microbes that are supported by dead or decaying plant and animal matter. And this detritus often accumulates as leaves or seeds or fruits fall into the container from surrounding vegetation. You can see some of the leaves here, or insects that fall into the water and drown and then break down. And this Aloncthinus detritus is vital to mosquito production in urban areas because unlike in a wetland, these containers are completely driven by the nutrients or inhibited by toxic secondary metabolites that are supplied by whatever detritus falls into that container. The quality and the quantity of the detritus resource base has been shown to influence larval survival, growth, intra and interspecific competition, and even the size, fecundity, and vector capabilities of the resulting adult mosquitoes. And we'll discuss that more later. In a matter of days, the larvae develop into pupae, which then emerge again as adults to continue the life cycle. So Aedes albopictus, the other most abundant species in the area, is also known as the tiger mosquito. It's a much more recent invader and is very successful, and also a very aggressive human biter. The life cycle is very similar. There's just a small difference in the way that the eggs are laid that allows Aedes albopictus to take advantage of smaller, more ephemeral containers like discarded food and drink packaging. So we've been studying these mosquitoes on 9 study blocks in each of 2 watersheds. That's the colored shapes that you see. You'll notice the blocks are fairly close together, but they have sometimes a steep difference in the median annual household income. So these maps show each block within the census tract, and the colors represent groupings by the relative low, medium, and high socioeconomic status. To give you an example of what that actually looks like, these are 2 photos I took maybe 10 blocks apart in West Baltimore. The one on the left is a photo of a property in the Harlem Park neighborhood. And on that block, more than half of the properties are abandoned and in some state of infrastructural decay, like what you see here. And for the houses on the block that are occupied, the median annual household income is about $26,000. By contrast, the property on the left is an occupied parcel in the Urban Square neighborhood, the Union Square neighborhood. Fewer than 10% of the properties on that block are abandoned, and the annual household income is about $36,000, so about $10,000 higher. And then this example is from the Watts Branch watershed. Photo on the left is a property in DC. The census tract containing that block has a median annual household income of a little over $31,000. The property on the right is of a house in Capitol Heights, Maryland, and the median annual household income is about double that. It's more like $62,000. So by studying and surveying both larval and adult mosquito communities in these socioeconomically diverse neighborhoods, our lab and our collaborators have found that mosquitoes in low-income neighborhoods are more abundant. Here you can see from Ledoux et al. 2013, both Aedes and Culex pupae were more dense in containers with a lower income in lower income neighborhoods compared to the high income neighborhoods. We've also found that mosquitoes are larger and they're more likely to be infected with West Nile virus compared to mosquitoes sampled from higher income neighborhoods. So these factors make mosquitoes in low-income areas more efficient vectors for disease, which puts residents in those areas at a disproportionate and an unjust risk of contracting mosquito-borne illnesses. And the question then is, why do we see these patterns in mosquito ecology along a socioeconomic gradient? There are several potential factors, and these all interact with each other, including human behavior, microclimate, and vegetation. And I'm especially interested in studying vegetation in this context because studies in urban areas, as I said, across the US have found that plant communities are related to socioeconomics as well. All of these studies have found that higher income urban neighborhoods have more abundant and more diverse vegetation than their lower income counterparts. So in my dissertation, I'll review those 3 factors and then dive into a study on aerial imagery. So because vegetation is an important resource for mosquitoes, we might expect that you would find more mosquitoes where you find more vegetation. But a study by Little et al. In 2017 on our study blocks in West Baltimore surveyed mosquitoes and also looked at the quantity of green space in the area using NDVI values. And they found that the overall quantity of green space was actually similar between low and high income neighborhoods, but there were many more mosquitoes in the low income neighborhoods. But if you zoom into that and compare multiple blocks that are all within a low socioeconomic status, then that pattern emerged where you see a correlation between mosquito abundance and plant abundance. So from this interaction, we can see that quantity of urban green space is really only part of the story. So in this second chapter, I'm going to consider the quality in addition to the quantity of green space on a broad scale. I'll analyze aerial imagery from Google Earth and characterize greenery in a coarse manner like managed versus unmanaged vegetation or open versus closed canopy. The idea being that while the total amount of green space may not correlate with mosquito abundance, perhaps the total amount of unmanaged green space will, or the total amount of closed canopy will, because it potentially hides more containers, in unmanaged greenery that can serve as breeding habitat, or closed canopy provides more shade, blocking harmful UV rays. And if we do find this relationship, if we can relate vegetation types broadly with mosquito abundance data that had been collected at the same time as the aerial imagery, this relationship could help mosquito management agencies use Google Earth as a tool to target at-risk areas without as much on-the-ground surveying. My third chapter has 3 main objectives, the first of which is to determine if plant communities vary along that socioeconomic gradient, but at a much finer scale than what I was just describing. So this past summer, I conducted ground and canopy surveys on residential properties in our study blocks, as well as placed baskets to passively sample vegetation, mirroring detritus that could fall into containers in these neighborhoods. So with this data, I can determine the most common species by watershed or by socioeconomic status. I can look at whether the richness of these plant communities differs along that gradient, or the ratio of native versus non-native vegetation, or the ratio of growth habits, like trees versus vines. And this matters because the plant community composition in a given area tells you what's available to fall into containers and what would be available as a resource base for mosquitoes in those areas. And as I mentioned before, previous studies have tested several of the plant community characteristics that I mentioned, from individual species to native versus non-native analogs, to grass versus tree leaves. And their results have shown that the type of detritus in a container can significantly affect larval development. So I'll be testing plant species on these 2 mosquitoes in controlled lab trials. And then third, in addition to testing Aedes albopictus and Helix pipiens separately from each other, I'll also test the effects when the 2 species are raised in the same container. In previous lab trials, Aedes albopictus is usually the superior competitor between the 2. So when they have limited resources in a shared container habitat, Aedes albopictus is more likely to outcompete for those resources. However, other studies have found that the composition of that resource base has the potential to alleviate or even reverse the outcome of competition, allowing the 2 to coexist. We do know from previous surveys that we can find coexistence between these 2 species in Baltimore and DC, and a deeper understanding of the surrounding plant community can help us understand why we're seeing coexistence in the pockets of city that we do. So in those lab experiments, I have the ability to isolate and separately test the effects of individual plant species. But of course, in the field, containers can contain multiple leaves or seeds, et cetera, from multiple plant species. Larval diet analyses have been done using stable isotope analysis that involves comparing the carbon to nitrogen ratios of both mosquito larvae and comparing that to the carbon to nitrogen ratios in plant resources in order to identify the detritus that larvae are feeding on. So in this example from Kaufman et al. In 2010, they raised mosquitoes on known detritus types like maple leaves or crickets, and then they were able to compare those known ratios to field samples that they'd collected of larvae or detritus types. So the implications of this proposed research are both theoretical and also applied. The questions that I'm asking focus on some really fundamental ecological relationships like inter and intraspecific competition that shape the ecosystem and inform our knowledge of community structure. But additionally, I'm hoping that the knowledge I'll generate will be useful for mosquito management agencies in controlling mosquitoes in order to protect public health and address environmental injustices. And with that, I'm hoping we have time for a few questions.
Okay, that was really interesting. Thank you. And let's see, we have a question from Jordan who says, do you happen to know if there is a link between the abundance of non-native invasive species and the SE gradients?
So I've started to go through the data that I collected from the surveys I did this summer and the samples that I've collected. And I am seeing that so far. If I compare, for example, the most common canopy species, the most frequent species that I've identified by block, according to their socioeconomic status, I've been seeing that the highest income status blocks in Watts Branch have no non-native trees among their 3 most common canopy species. Conversely, if you look at the lowest blocks in Baltimore, every single one of the top canopy species has been non-native. So yeah, I am finding that link.
Interesting, yeah. And then a question I had as well, and Dr. Peer asked was, do we know if anyone has looked at the vegetation that the adult mosquitoes eat? So do they have, and then are there additionally species preferences to that?
Adults can be a little trickier to study than larvae, because the larvae are confined in these containers. So not quite as much work has been done on adult species, but there are some really interesting studies I've read. There was one by Manda et al. In 2017 that looked at Anopheles mosquitoes in Africa. And they did find preferences by mosquitoes according to the sugar composition and concentration. So different plants, depending on the sugar concentrations, were helpful in prolonging mosquito lifespan and giving them more energy for longer flight durations. So mosquitoes do seem to have a preference. I don't think any of that has been done for adult mosquitoes in Baltimore or DC.
Interesting. So I have a related question because I was at the nursery on Saturday and I saw plants that they had tagged that were supposed to keep mosquitoes away.
Yeah.
Is that true? Or am I wasting my money if I bought something for my yard?
I don't think most of that has actually been scientifically backed. There was another study again on Anopheles mosquitoes, which you find more in Africa. And I think it's a really interesting question, and I'm not willing to test it because the way this other study did it was they had 2 little huts spaced apart from each other with different plants. And then they had a person stationed in those huts all night that counted and trapped all the mosquitoes that bit them. And I think they did find a significant difference, but I'm not willing to sit outside all night and count how many mosquitoes bite me. So that can be done if you're willing to do it.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much, Sarah. Really interesting. And I'll look forward to seeing the results of this study.
Thank you.